Caleb stepped forward, basket in hand, his small frame dwarfed by the towering steel of the gorilla enclosure. 100 eyes followed him, parents holding their breath, trainers gripping their radios, as he approached the narrow feeding gate. From the shadows, Bantau moved. Without warning, a massive hand shot through the opening, grabbing the boy's shirt and pulling him hard against the mesh. Gasps ripped through the crowd, mothers screamed, trainers froze. In that instant, everything Silver Creek had promised, safety, control, predictability, collapsed into primal chaos. It was supposed to be a gift. It became something else entirely. And as Caleb locked eyes with the silverback towering over him, but what happened next surprised everyone. Caleb wasn't like the other kids. While others kicked soccer balls and played video games, Caleb spent hours crouched in the grass, studying ants, feeding stray cats, whispering to the birds perched on backyard fences. His world made more sense when it wasn't talking back. Born 2 months premature, Caleb had spent his earliest days in a hospital incubator, his first connection to life, fragile and distant. Maybe that's why he trusted animals more than people. Animals didn't shout. Animals didn't break promises. They simply were. There was one moment when Caleb was 4 that his parents never forgot. They found him outside one rainy afternoon, kneeling in the mud beside a wounded squirrel. Most kids would have screamed, poked it with a stick, run for help. But Caleb sat there for hours, soaked to the skin, cupping his tiny hands over the creature's shivering body. When they finally peeled him away, he cried for the squirrel as if it were his brother. Even then, Caleb didn't understand cruelty, only loyalty. By the time he was 5, Caleb's obsession with animals wasn't just a hobby, it was a language only he understood. His parents, desperate to help him find connection, enrolled him in the Junior Ranger program at Silver Creek Wildlife Sanctuary, hoping he'd finally find his place among others who shared his wonder. But Silver Creek's greatest pride wasn't its trainers or its programs. It was Bantau. Bantau wasn't like the other gorillas either. Taken from the wild as an infant after poachers slaughtered his troop, Bantau had known only the cold, sterile logic of captivity. He was no stranger to human touch, but he remembered, in ways too deep to explain, what it meant to be stolen. There were days, even after years of domestication, when trainers would catch Bantau sitting motionless in the corner of his habitat, his back turned to the visitors, rocking slightly, quietly. They said it was nothing, habit, leftover instincts. But a few of the older keepers knew better. They remembered the day Bantau arrived, just a baby, barely clinging to life, his fingers bloodied from clawing at the sides of the crate that carried him from the jungle to the concrete walls of his new world. His stillness wasn't peace. It was mourning. 2 broken lives, one born too soon, the other stolen too soon. Both learning in different cages that the world could be cruel to the small, the curious, the innocent. And now, by some twist of fate, Caleb and Bantau stood on opposite sides of the same invisible line, the one between trust and fear, between wildness and civilization. And in one impossible moment, that line would shatter. Caleb knelt down, his small hands steady, as he placed the wicker basket just inside the marked yellow zone. Trainers watched from behind the safety line, nerves taut but trusting the routine. Everything about this moment was rehearsed, predictable, safe, until it wasn't. From behind the feeding gate, a shadow moved. Bantau's massive hand, larger than Caleb's entire torso, slipped through the narrow opening with eerie precision. At first, it was just a brush, a curious tap at the basket, an accidental nudge. But then, in one slow, deliberate motion, he seized the back of Caleb's shirt and yanked him forward against the mesh. The metal clanged violently. Caleb stumbled, the world tilting sideways as his body slammed into the wire barrier. For a heartbeat, there was only stunned silence. Then the screaming started. Mothers grabbed their children. Fathers shouted orders. Sanctuary workers froze, training warring with instinct, intervene too soon and trigger panic, intervene too late and watch tragedy unfold. Caleb felt the rough mesh bite into his skin. He wanted to cry out, wanted to call for his mother, but somehow, in that strange, suspended second, he didn't. Instead, he looked up, and what he saw was not rage. It wasn't hunger. It was a pair of eyes as wide and startled as his own. Bantau's grip wasn't crushing. It was firm, as if anchoring Caleb in place, keeping him from something worse that might come. In that split second, Caleb wasn't a guest anymore. He wasn't even a boy. He was prey, or something far more sacred. The sanctuary's rules, its assurances, its polished image of harmony, shattered, useless against the raw, ancient truth pressed up against the wire. Across the enclosure, two juvenile gorillas, teenagers, mischievous and impulsive, noticed the commotion and began to drift closer. Their movements were quick, unpredictable. Trainers' radios flared to life with urgent calls. Eyes on the juveniles, keep them back. Team B positioned on the north wall. The trainers knew, if the younger gorillas got involved, chaos would explode. Bantau knew it too. With a sudden deep grunt, low and resonant like distant thunder, Bantau barked a warning. The juveniles froze. One tried to step closer, and Bantau bared his teeth, a terrifying display of dominance. The youngsters backed away, cowed, slinking into the foliage like chastised children. Bantau turned his gaze back to Caleb, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a primitive kind of understanding that had nothing to do with words or training or civilization. It was instinct meeting innocence. Beyond the barrier, chaos rippled through the human crowd. Caleb's parents screamed his name, their voices cracking under the weight of unimaginable fear. Some visitors bolted toward exits. Others, frozen in horror, captured the unfolding drama with trembling hands on their phones. But inside the enclosure, between the wire and the watchers, it was almost calm. Caleb didn't move, didn't fight, didn't cry. Bantau didn't squeeze, didn't snarl, didn't hurt. They simply stayed there. Two lives tangled by accident, staring into the impossible space between fear and faith. And behind the mesh, Bantau's eyes weren't filled with rage. They were filled with something far more dangerous: intention. Chaos ripped through the sanctuary like a storm. Trainers scrambled into position, radios barking overlapping commands. Hands fumbled for tranquilizer darts. Every second stretched out, thick and unbearable. Caleb's parents pressed against the barrier, desperate, shouting for their son. His mother's screams were raw, stripped down to something primal. His father tried to climb the fence, only to be pulled back by security guards. A scuffle that almost turned violent itself. Beyond the mesh, Caleb hung limp in Bantau's grasp. Not struggling, not crying, just still. Eyes wide, staring up at the giant who held him. But Bantau wasn't hurting him. He cradled Caleb, one arm wrapped across the boy's chest, the other shielding him from the growing noise of the crowd. His massive frame shuddered once, not with rage, but with something closer to fear. Inside the trainer's comms tent, the debate raged. If we get a clean shot, we take it. No, a dart could spike his adrenaline, make him lash out. If we wait and he panics, the boy's dead anyway. The lead trainer, a woman who had worked with Bantau for over a decade, gripped the radio so tightly her knuckles went white. "He's not attacking," she said, voice trembling. "He's protecting." But protocol screamed otherwise. Protocol said, a human life in danger means immediate action. They trained for this, they rehearsed this, and yet, standing there with weapons raised, they all hesitated. Because somewhere deep inside, against every logical command, they saw the truth in Bantau's posture. The wild was not trying to kill the boy, it was trying to save him. Do they intervene, trusting their training but risking everything? Or do they wait, trusting the wild, something they'd spent their entire lives taught to fear, control, dominate? One of the trainers tried an idea. Desperate, improvised, he sprinted to the back entrance of the enclosure and threw open a hidden hatch, revealing a cart filled with Bantau's favorite treats: bananas, figs, pieces of sugar cane. He grabbed a piece of ripe melon, held it high, and called out in the low, rhythmic tones trainers use during feeding exercises. "Come, Bantau. Here, boy, it's okay. Come." Bantau's ears twitched, his body tensed. For a moment hope fluttered in the air. But Bantau didn't move. He kept his huge body between Caleb and the rest of the enclosure, watching the humans warily, as if weighing, calculating whether they could be trusted with the precious life tucked under his arm. Beyond the trainers, the younger gorillas still watched from a distance, shifting nervously, ready to surge forward if something went wrong. The fracture widened. Trust the system and risk Caleb's life. Trust the wild and risk everything they thought they knew? For the first time, the question wasn't just about saving the boy. It was about what saving even meant. One trainer's finger tightened against the trigger of his dart gun. The lead trainer saw it and stepped in front of his line of fire, blocking his shot. "Wait," she whispered. "Just wait." The seconds dragged on, thick and brutal. When we fear nature, are we betraying it or saving ourselves? The answer wasn't clear, and every heartbeat pushed them closer to a decision they could never take back. The trainers stood frozen, darts raised, breathing shallow. Caleb's parents clutched each other, half praying, half bracing for the scream they couldn't bear to hear. Beyond the barrier, Bantau's giant hand loosened slightly, no longer gripping Caleb's shirt but holding him steady, cradling him almost. For a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. Then Caleb did something no one could have predicted. With small, trembling fingers, he reached up and touched Bantau's forearm, the thick, dark fur soft under his palm. He wasn't fighting, he wasn't pulling away, he was choosing trust. Bantau froze at the touch. A low rumble vibrated through his chest, not a growl, not a threat. Something deeper, older. A sound passed from mother to child in a language that existed long before human words. The crowd fell into a stunned, reverent silence. Mothers who had screamed now covered their mouths. Fathers who had shouted now lowered their heads. Some, without understanding why, began to cry. One by one, the trainers lowered their tranquilizer guns. Hands that had been shaking with adrenaline now shook with something else entirely: awe. Slowly, impossibly, Bantau rose to his full height, lifting Caleb slightly off the ground in the curve of his massive arm. His movements weren't frantic. They were careful, deliberate. He turned, his broad back shielding Caleb from the other gorillas, and walked toward the keeper's gate, the service entrance the staff used to feed and check the animals. It was as if he knew, as if he understood where safety lived. Halfway there, Bantau paused. He turned slightly, looking over his shoulder at the humans beyond the barrier. A long, searching look. Not fear, not anger, something closer to accusation. Or maybe hope. He set Caleb down gently beside the gate, not pushing him away, not abandoning him, but offering him back. One worker dropped to his knees at the access hatch, unlatching it with trembling hands. Caleb stumbled forward, wide-eyed but unhurt, and was swept into the arms of waiting trainers. The boy didn't cry. He didn't scream. He looked back once, one long, aching look, and then disappeared behind a wall of uniforms. And Bantau just stood there, breathing hard, head bowed. He had done his part. He had protected the fragile thing entrusted to him. And, for a few terrible, beautiful seconds, he had proven something no one had wanted to believe. Bantau hadn't dragged Caleb to hurt him. Bantau had claimed Caleb the way he might claim an orphaned infant in the wild, fragile, defenseless, his. The twist wasn't in what Bantau did. The twist was in what humanity expected him to do. We assumed violence. He offered trust. And in doing so, he exposed something raw and uncomfortable beneath our carefully polished beliefs. Sometimes, the wild is more human than we are. As the trainers tended to Caleb, no one noticed Bantau retreating slowly back toward the shade of his habitat. No applause, no celebration. Only the heavy, terrible knowledge that the world outside his cage would never understand what had just happened, or what it had cost him. Caleb was lifted carefully from the ground, arms wrapping around his mother's neck the moment he reached the other side of the barrier. His father wrapped them both in his arms, holding them so tightly it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Trainers whispered orders. Sanctuary medics hovered close, checking Caleb for injuries. He had a few minor scrapes across his arms where the mesh had pressed into his skin, but beyond that he was untouched, at least on the outside. Bantau watched from the other side of the mesh, unmoving. No rage, no fear, just a quiet sadness that no one could explain or dared to face. Within the hour, sanctuary officials made their decision. Bantau would be removed from public exposure immediately. He would be relocated to the older, isolated section of the reserve, a place designed for dangerous or unpredictable animals, a place where no human child would ever touch him again. Protocols were updated, feeding procedures revised, visitor interaction zones cordoned off permanently. Official reports painted the event as an unforeseen risk successfully mitigated. Public statements were carefully worded, cold, clinical. At no point was the boy in significant danger, one spokesman claimed on local news, the tremor in his voice betraying the lie. Behind closed doors, a different story haunted those who had seen the truth with their own eyes, those who had witnessed what Bantau had chosen, and how humanity had responded. Bantau had followed his instincts, not to harm, but to protect, and for that he was treated not as a hero, but as a liability. In the days that followed, Caleb struggled to understand what had happened. He asked his parents over and over if he could visit Bantau. He drew crayon pictures of a big smiling gorilla and a little boy holding hands, and taped them to the refrigerator. His parents told him it wasn't possible, that Bantau had gone away, that it was for everyone's safety. Caleb cried for nights afterward, not out of fear, but because he missed his friend. Meanwhile, video clips of the encounter spread online, grainy footage captured by trembling hands. The media exploded. Some called Bantau a hero. Animal rights groups demanded he be honored, not punished. Others, driven by fear, demanded he be put down, a risk too great to ever repeat. Sanctuary officials faced a firestorm they weren't prepared for. Donors pulled funding. Families canceled memberships. Investigations were launched. All the while, Bantau remained silent, locked away behind reinforced barriers, thicker and colder than before. In his new enclosure, there were no visitors, no enrichment games, no soft calls of children's laughter from across the walls, only the endless stretch of metal and concrete, and the faint echoes of a trust that had been offered and rejected. Sometimes staff would find him sitting by the fence, staring out at the empty pathways, unmoving for hours. Other times he would turn his back to the world completely, as he had done in those first brutal days after his capture, as if he understood on some deep level that he had crossed a line he never should have dared to cross. Not the line between animal and man, but the one between hope and reality. And somewhere in the sanctuary's brightly lit visitor center, buried under glass, a plaque still proclaimed Silver Creek's mission: to foster trust between species and to honor the wild within us all. A mission they had betrayed the moment Bantau reached out with mercy, and was met in return with fear. No one ever explained this to Caleb. No one ever told him that sometimes, when the wild offers its heart, the civilized world only knows how to cage it. And somewhere, behind reinforced walls and silent steel, a silverback sat alone, staring through the gaps of his enclosure at a world he once tried to touch, and was punished for believing he could.